Well, good evening, and welcome to the fifth in my series of seminars on graduate hypnotherapy. That's kind of a misnomer at some level, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But when I was in graduate school, there was this crazy movie about this boy in Africa. He was a kind of one of the nomadic African herders or something like that, and he was wandering around in the desert, and this bottle falls out of the sky from an airplane, and he decided this is something that the gods need back. These people flying around in airplanes must be gods. That's how he interpreted things. And so he goes on this mission to return this bottle to the gods. And the movie was titled "The Gods Are Crazy." And this is one of the things that, I think one of the principles or goals of that movie was to try to make people in America aware of how different our view of the world is and our experience of the world is from the vast number of people that still live in conditions where they're almost going day to day and don't really have the kind of infrastructure that we have to protect us from the elements and to bring us information and allow us to connect to the world without having to put very much effort into it. This boy had to put a lot of effort into getting into the city, to a place where he could actually try to find the gods that had gifted this bottle to the world and that probably needed it back. In the intervening 30 years, I think that we've seen that a shift in that situation as climate change has advanced and as economic disparities and the developed nations have advanced. There's more and more of us that are kind of approaching that kind of situation where we have our concerns are very, very foundational. A lot of us are traveling towards the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy, which is being concerned about shelter and food and just basic needs. And in the major cities, that's not necessarily as clear as in the rural areas, where actually the minority life expectancy in urban areas is actually higher than it is among Caucasians in the rural areas of our country, because all the hospitals are closing down. So they can't get the kind of care that you get in urban areas, even if you're poor. So in thinking about that problem and looking at the difficulties that we have in organizing the political will to kind of make a change and to improve people's lives and to deal with these very serious problems that we're confronting, I kind of turned, even when I was in graduate school, towards spirituality and this quest for understanding love and how it worked. And at this point in time, it was popular in that era. I went to UC Berkeley, and you would have the Spartacus Youth League out on the plaza around Sather Gate, Sproul Plaza, just below Sather Gate. And, it was like the kind of received wisdom among most intellectuals was that religion was the opiate of the masses, as Marx stated. And my conclusion as I've aged and watched things develop and come to understand how love works and modified my view of physics to actually give me some kind of confidence that what I'm doing is real when I'm loving people and when I'm loving the world. What I've concluded is that actually gods aren't crazy. For us to focus on creating gods, in the sense, whether it's the tantric sense in which the Buddhists do it, or whether it's in the sense of praying fervently for the people that we care about, that this is the mechanism that we need to solve the problems that we're confronting right now. And one of the things that I feel that we're going through is this demonstration that we can't do it by human mechanisms. It's simply the political mechanisms and the financial pressures and the balance of power in the human institutions mitigates against adaptation and change, the way that we have to adapt and change in order to solve the problems we're facing. And so where we need to focus is on building power in connections to this source of love, which I feel so grateful to be in contact with. And so what I'm going to do today is actually one of the places where that conclusion of Marx's, that, you know, religion is the opiate of the masses, one of the places where he was standing on, one of the foundations for that statement was fundamental physics, in the belief that, you know, what is written in the Bible, miracles, you know, spiritual experiences, precognition, and kind of faith healings and things like that. These were all just, you know, people being crazy. They would have gotten better anyways. You know, you can't. That idea was something that was you had received in an earlier time and you just forgotten about it. Now it popped it up. You're giving it credit to it for the Holy Spirit and things like that. You know, that physics itself has been a significant justification for the idea that gods don't exist. And so what I want to do with this talk today is to kind of talk about that journey, the journey into spirituality, and how humanity evolved our religions and our spiritual avatars, and where we're at with that at that point in this point of human history with that process, and then to look at science and how science got to where it is. And then what I'm going to do is look at the standard model of physics, which says that space is empty, that there, you know, there is nothing in the vacuum, and so there are no souls. We just have our bodies, and all action is local, and that time moves linearly forward, so you can't know the future before it happens. There's just all these constraints in modern theories of physics, which contradicts our spiritual experience. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that model, but at a very high level, because what I want to focus on is its inconsistencies. And then once I've exposed those inconsistencies, I'm going to propose a different model that allows spiritual experience and that actually explains lots of things that the physicists can't explain about the way that the world is, the way that this reality is. And then I'm going to look at that now, saying, looking at the characteristics of this reality that we're in, what does this say about, you know, what our great lovers of reality, our great religious avatars have said about the way that we need to relate to each other and the world in order to have a sustainable and joyful existence here on this planet. So what I'm looking to hopefully accomplish in this presentation, and this goes back, I started this process when I was in graduate school, as I said. What I'm hoping to do is to provide the people that are following me with the tools that they need to avoid a lot of really unpleasant experiences. So that's the journey that we're going on today. Now, this is part of my graduate series in hypnosis and hypnotherapy. This is important to me because it's the foundation for the collaborative hypnotherapy that I talk about so much. But it's also because there's a lot of things that happen in hypnotherapy with you know, alternative lives and certain kinds of imagery that we use with regards to bringing down healing energy, focusing it in the body and things like that. And I want people to have a lot more confidence in what they're doing when they're doing those kinds of procedures, that there are some very, very significant energies and support that we draw upon. And if we understand how it works and we understand the constraints, because there are constraints when you're tapping into that energy, if we understand the constraints, then we can really help people to have some wonderful outcomes in situations where they really have reason under modern science to believe that there's no hope. Okay, so the roadmap for the presentation is search for explanations.
Can I just interrupt you for 1 minute?
Sure, go ahead.
Because you're recording this and I'm sure you care about the sound. I don't know, maybe you have a fan going. I'm not sure, but I hear kind of like some wind. I don't know if that's just me, if Lauren hears it too. But I just want you to be aware of that. It's not bothering me, but it might
Okay,
disrupt your recording.
yes, I'll just leave it as it is. The winds of change are blowing. So we'll just accept that as a metaphor. So I'm going to talk about humanity. You know, one of the things we do is we've got an intellect, and we always like to understand why things happen, particularly unpleasant things. And there's been two pathways in terms of finding those explanations. One is spirituality, and the other one is physics. And so I'm going to talk about those two journeys and kind of get you situated as to why we're at this point that we're at in this process. Okay, why is it that these two aspects of human experience and human understanding don't integrate very well at all? Okay. Then I'm going to talk about the standard model of the universe and talk about some of its defects and deal with a very, I mean, I say sometimes that this is the last hurrah of selfishness because people are just doing it right out in the open. And there's certain information out in the world of physics right now that it's just right out in the open. If you understand what the information is saying and you understand the kind of experiments that are done and things like that, it's really clear that there's been a huge fraud perpetrated upon us. Fraud that has cost us tens of billions of dollars. Okay. So what we'll then do is we'll step on and talk about this alternative theory, which is rather than starting from a very complex initial state of the universe, we're going to start with a very simple initial state of the universe, which is a universe of one dimension, and talk about how, taking that as a model, how you can kind of compose it as to where you get more complex universes, including our universe. And we're going to find that in thinking about this problem, taking this picture of the problem, we're going to find it doesn't take a lot to create a model of the universe which has a lot of the characteristics, at least abstractly, conceptually, of the models that people believe are so successful, but that also supports spirituality. And then we'll talk about the spiritual principles and wisdom that I have gained about the attitude that needs to be adopted when you're interacting with these forces. Remember, this is a structure of the universe which is beneath the atom. The energies that exist down at this level of reality can be very powerful. And there's very strong protective mechanisms in place. And so there's just certain attitudes that we have to take. But there are also the attitudes that I think that people who recognize that the only way that they can manage in this current environment that we're going through is by caring about themselves and other people and banding together in caring. That's becoming clearer and clearer. And I think will become very obvious to many people in the next decade or so, that this is the only way through. So search for explanations. So there is a fundamental question, which is the Gnostic question. And I'm sure you've heard of agnosticism. And we quite often say that agnostics say that they don't know whether God exists or not. But actually, agnostic is a response to a specific question in the original formulation of in ancient philosophy. So the Gnostic question is, can the meaning of experience be discerned by the senses? And the agnostic says, yes, everything that we need to know about the world around us is perceivable by our physical senses. And when you take that, you get to scientific materialism and free market economics, which are kind of like the pillars of the way that we manage society right now. Scientific materialism is great because you can change the world. You know, we've got these wonderful computers that never would have existed. We've got houses, we've got roads, we've got cars, all kinds of things that never would have existed in the natural world. And then the free market economics says, well, you know, it's all a deterministic system running based upon known fixed rules, and you don't want to interfere in the operation of that system, because when you interfere with the operation of the system, you're going to bias its performance, and it's not going to give you the conclusions that are natural and right in a deterministic system. So these are the two the two fundamental principles that underlie the way that our society operates right now. The Gnostic position is no, you can't determine the meaning of experience just by your senses. What it says is the unfolding of reality is guided by a powerful purpose, which was baked into the design of this reality. And when we align ourselves with that purpose, we move more efficiently through space and time. And that grace manifests as spiritual influence. What that means is that as we are walking through the world, energies surround us and subscribe to our purpose, to our intentions. And so things that are unexpected happen. You know, things that you can't, you know, a rock moves or something like that, or somebody gets healed, okay? And there's no objective evidence that of how that happened. There was no drug administered. There was no earth mover. You know, just things change because this energy is entrained along with you because you're aligned with the purpose of the reality as it's been constructed. Okay, so the spiritual perspective and this quest of spirituality is really about trying to examine the Gnostic answer and to follow the Gnostic answer to its conclusion. So what is spirituality? I define it as the negotiation of the boundaries between I and we. And the thing is, if we have souls, they extend outside of our body and we can connect them together and we can join our souls together and we can have experiences that our experiences had as a we. But we can also choose to separate our souls and come into our body. That's part of the gift of a body, is that you can, it's dense and you can just be in your body and prevent other souls from coming into and interacting with your soul. That's a choice that we have. So this is the challenge of spirituality. And one of the things that happens is that we're not the only creatures that have spirits. And you see this in the evidence of precursor spirituality, that animals have to solve this problem just as much as people do. That a lion eating an antelope on the savannah in Africa is not just taking part of the meat, he's actually taking part of the antelope's spirit into him. And that part of what we do with our bodies and this model and this understanding of spirituality is that we're using the attachment of spirit to matter to try to reconfigure it. And this has been going on for at least 300 million years. And the basic principles are manifested, they go back that far, but they're manifested in certain patterns of human behavior. Okay, now on the female side, maternity, carrying a creature inside of you, okay, and bringing it into the world. Okay, that's a deep bond, deep organic bond. On the far masculine side, you have the hunt, which is there's stuff lying out in the world. Let's go and get it. And not be too concerned necessarily about, you know, why it's there and what its intentions are. We need this in order to survive. And animals have been doing this for a long time. Predators eat prey. Okay, and so this is a blood spiritual kind of an activity. And one of the things that ancient hunters would do is they would actually wear the skins of antelopes and the things that they were hunting, because that skin still had that animal spirit in it. That's how they understood it. And this is primarily a masculine activity. And this has to do with the, not necessarily with the differential in size between men and women, because that's not always consistent. You have smaller men, you have larger women, but it's the fact that women bear children and they have to stay in place and take care of them and keep them collected together so they don't get preyed on by themselves. Human babies are very, very vulnerable. So what happens is that there's, you know, you now have these two intermediate things, which is sex and sacrifice. In human beings, the sexual impulse, that blood right, okay, tends to actually have power focused in women, even though women are quite often exploited in this sense. There's a reason why the world's oldest profession is prostitution. Okay, it's because men are on all the time sexually. Okay, well, women go through cycles, and so a man's sexual drive is a far more convenient way of controlling him if you know how to manipulate it than a woman's sexual drive, because woman's sexual drive is irregular. So the balance of power, although it's kind of shared between both, okay, the balance of power tends to tip more towards women. Now, in terms of sacrifice, what ends up happening is that in a herd, when the predators come and they're hungry and they're going to hang around until they get something to eat, what happens is that the herd runs off and leaves behind the old and the weak. Okay, and that's sacrifice. Well, what we do in human societies, this gets manifested most extremely in wars. Okay, where we send men out to do battle as a sacrifice to protect those that are behind. So this is kind of what we started with when we began our spiritual journey. These four blood kinds of rites that we brought forward from our animal heritage. And when you begin to see worship and creatures of worship, or icons of worship, the oldest ones are animal gods. You know, in the Central American culture, you have these serpent gods. In Egypt, you have various different animal gods, crocodiles and owls and things like that. In the most kind of I would say kind of whimsical of these, you have, for example, Ganesha in the Indian pantheon, where apocryphally it was either an elephant that assumed human characteristics, or it was that Shiva and Parvati had a child, and somehow the child's head got cut off, and so Brahma came along and went to find a head for the child, and he found an elephant lying by the side of the road, so he put a head. I mean, there's some really whimsical interpretations about how Ganesha came to be in the pantheon with his particular characteristics. But if you go back, what you find is you find all of these kinds of icons in human spiritual history. So what this is saying is that there was some benefit to these ancient animal spiritual aggregates to partnering with humanity, because human beings can think and they can design. Okay, and so this 300 million year old animal spirituality, when it was projected into human beings, when we first appeared out in the world, the energy was all on that side. And so what happened is there was this beneficial partnership initially between the two parties, between the animal energies and the novel human capacity to think and reason and plan and design. So as we matured in this partnership with them, what we began to have is rites of passage. And but the rite of passage, typically it's a coming of age ceremony. As you enter into puberty, you get sent out into the wilderness, and you have to survive on your own. And quite often there's a spiritual aspect, which is part of you attaining the wisdom and the capacity and the skill to survive, is that an animal avatar of some kind, your spirit guide, comes and resides with you and helps you to survive in the hostile wild environment. So you know, you have this in all primitive cultures at various different levels of sophistication. But what's happening here is that this is a situation where this is a human right that humans design to establish this partnership between the animal energies and human beings. And eventually, this became an institution in its own right. And so here on the right, I'm showing a frieze from a temple that was discovered in ancient in Rome. They were excavating for some purpose along the Tiber River, and they found this building that had been submerged, basically, and they dug it out, and they had these frescoes on the walls. And what it was is it was a bachelorette party, although it doesn't have any of those connotations that we have in our modern society. But it was a proving ground for women before they got married. And what you see here is a scene where you have this young woman on the left who's partially disrobed, and she looks completely exhausted. And what's happening is they're putting her through a ritual to simulate childbirth, because they knew that women lost their senses, they went crazy due to the pain of childbirth, and this was not an infrequent occurrence, or if they did not have the physical stamina, they would die. And this is a bad thing for everybody. The husband was left with a bunch of children that he had to take care of. You know, it was a disaster for the children. The stability of the household was undermined, and the functions of the household couldn't be performed. And so what they do is they would put women through this rite to demonstrate whether they were capable of getting through childbirth or not. And if they could not get through the rite, they would go into religious orders. They would call off the wedding and go into religious orders. So this is the kind of rite of passage which evolved in confrontation with our animal nature before we had the technology to really free ourselves from these kinds of limitations. So you come forward about 10,000 years, and what happens is that as you're getting exposed to these animal energies carried forward from the past, and go through these rites, you know, there's some wisdom that evolved about how to prepare people for these kinds of transitions. And so you see a kind of an energy center wisdom. And there's various different formulations of this. There's one in Mesoamerica, there's the Tibetan mandala, there's the hermeneutic wisdom, our energy system, which has been carried forward to the Kabbalah. And then there's the Vedic system in India. And what's characteristic of all of these is that we mature in a certain order as personalities. And as we do that maturation, the intention and the focus of our sensibility and sensitivity about the challenges that we're facing in life tends to move into different parts of our body. Okay, and so what we're doing is we're maturing, is we're learning how to manage different parts of our body, more or less, and that having balance between all the systems of the body in full control enabled the practitioner or the acolyte to be in control of his spiritual journey. So this is a process where now you're beginning to, people are looking to liberate themselves from dependency on that primitive blood spirituality that came forward from the past, from our Darwinian heritage. I really like the Mesoamerican formulation of this. It's called the light will system. And each of there's 10 of these things that you engage with as a personal level. And so the root level is kind of like the plant reality, the plant realm of consciousness. And you walk up through these 10 realms of consciousness. And what's really interesting about this one is that there's actually 20 total levels, because the practitioner, once they get to the top level, they are now integrated and they have to raise their community up through all the levels. And so there's this explicit thing that you do not do this journey alone. And that once you complete it for yourself, you have this responsibility and this obligation to engage in bringing others along with you. So one of the things that I encountered when I was doing Buddhist meditation experiences was, one of the people said he was having a lot of trouble with his inner voice. You kept on hearing thoughts, You know, he was really clear for a long time, and then he got to a point where he just kept on hearing thoughts, and he didn't understand where the thoughts were coming from. And what I said to him was, okay, just send them meta. Okay, you are becoming a beacon to the people around you. And when they are in their anxious moments, they're reaching out for some sense of stability, for some anchor that they can lean up against. So just send them loving kindness. Okay, that's what you need to do in that situation. So a lot of people, when they look at these systems and get oriented towards them, this is what you need in order to become the person that you're meant to be. The thing that's beautiful about the Mesoamerican system is it doesn't stop there. Okay, you get to this point, and then you have this role of bringing other people along with you. So as people began to manifest in various different ways in this regard and achieve certain levels of maturity, we began to have specific human avatars. And these we carry forward up to the very, very present. You know, there's Moses is one of the avatars of the Judeo-Christian or of the traditions of Abraham. On the right-hand side here, I have Tara, who is a tantric deity. And then obviously we have, you know, people like Gandhi, who became the focus of so much hope in India due to his intention, to his compliance with the constraints of the Gnostic path, which is to not pass judgment on anybody, to always look for the best for everyone, to try to bring people together. And he became a focal point for that society as it worked through this problem of separating itself from oppression. So we need a lot more people like this. We had Martin Luther King Jr. here in America in the 60s. Some people would include Malcolm X among that number. You have Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and others all around the world. But this is specifically a situation now where humanity is saying, we stand alone. We have our own spirituality, and we have our own exemplars. And rather than turning to other creatures for guidance as to how to become fully evolved, we now have these exemplars in our past that we turn to, and that we can lean up against energetically as we're seeking guidance. In Tibetan Buddhism and the mandala system, there's 12 energy centers in the body, and they're populated by feminine carnal deities called dakinis. And so again, it's a situation where in terms of inspecting ourselves, we're engaging with human psychologies as opposed to more primitive animal psychologies. So here we are, we're rising up from that primitive, continue to rise up from that primitive-led spirituality. Unfortunately, the last stage on this process is ideas. And ideas are deities in some sense. There's constructs that we create in our minds that we share with each other, and they take on a life of their own. One of the things about human avatars is that you can identify with them in some sense. You can aspire to be like them. Okay, but among the ideas that we worship these days and tend to focus our aspirations around are things like nations. You can't aspire to be a nation. And it's kind of interesting, this poster comes from the French Revolution, and it's got these wonderful initial words: unite indivisibly in the Republic of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And it ends, or death. Okay, so we always have this balance in our societies between, we want to achieve this and we're willing to kill people for it or die ourselves. Okay, we're willing to fight for this. So there's this tension between our highest aspirations and quite often the mechanisms that we use to realize them. And this is what nations tend to do to us. This is part of the reason why the Greeks called their pantheon from 30 some odd gods to 12 in the Olympians, was because there was just too much drama among the adherents of the different gods. Okay, you had He had to bring things together. And this is why Socrates, through Plato, said there's got to be one God. I'm tired of this. This is just not working. Okay, we need to put a God above them all. Okay, to try to get around all this conflict that exists in the deities. Another one is money. Money is a way of storing power. But at this point in time, it's just got a life of its own. For example, we all need a house, and it takes a certain amount of energy to build a house. And you'd think that the price of a house should reflect the amount of energy and how much manpower it takes to build a house. But it absolutely does not. The price of a house has entirely to do with your capacity to pay. And one of the things that I'm was astonished at was when I was growing up as a child, I was told you should spend 30% of your monthly income on your mortgage. And I'm seeing housing prices going up and housing prices going up and housing prices going up. And I went to a networking meeting and somebody handed me something that said that a couple making $72,000 a year can qualify for a $600,000 mortgage. I'm going, wow, how the heck are they doing that? This is before the interest rates came down to 2% or 1%. And I looked and they had decided that now the couple could afford to spend half their income on their housing. And so what's happened is that the logic of money, which is that money is power in of itself, it doesn't have to be attached to any good, has created a system, which is a God of some kind, of spiritual logic, a rationale among the community of people who manage money to get us in debt and keep us in debt. And right now, what we're living in is an Usurian society, where the society is organized to get you as deeply in debt as you possibly can and have you work for the rest of your life paying off debt so that the people who have money get more money. So this is a spiritual system. The logic of this system is very, very powerful. And the people who are managing the system do not think in these terms. They think in terms of facilitating the flow of energy in the society. They think that they're doing something good. And they're caught up in this worldview and they don't pay any attention to actually what's happening down at the ground. And then down at the lower right-hand side, we have science and views of what's going on in reality and how reality operates. And this is again a form of conditioning that we subscribe to controls how we think about solving problems. It's a God of a certain type. And the reason why we subscribe to this God is because science is the power, that is the framework and the process for which we develop understanding that powers engineering, which enables us to escape the bounds of Darwinian evolution, where an animal can only change its configuration every generation. I can change my configuration in 5 seconds by putting a pair of glasses on or looking through a microscope. Okay, and so science has enabled us to beat Darwinian evolution, to where we've just wiped everything out now. We evolve millions of times faster than other creatures do, based upon what our intentions are. And so we subscribe to science because it's delivered this great good to us. But in itself, it is a way of thinking about the world. Okay, so now that's where we're at in the journey, our journey of spirituality. And what a lot of us don't understand is that it's been this journey, all I'm trying to point out, I should say, is it's been this journey of liberation from blood spirituality. And that has led into worship of very powerful spiritual structures, which are completely abstract and actually almost completely divorced from the lived experience of the great mass of humanity. Okay, it's gone so far that we no longer, the things that we worship no longer even relate to us anymore. Physically, they have no organic, we have no organic affiliation with them at all. And this is a very dangerous place to be in. Okay. So now let's look at physics. So what is physics? It's the behavior of things that lack personality. Okay. Or in other words, things that have very simple souls. If they deserve that to be said that they have a soul at all. And at the end of this presentation, I'll make it clear what I mean by that. Okay, so back in the beginning of physics, the first problem was classification. The world is this enormously complex place. Okay, and if you just wander around and allow your senses to receive information, okay, well, it's just a big blur. If you look carefully, you might be able to see the sheep there, individual sheep, close to you. Farther away, it's not necessarily so obvious. Okay, but what classification does is it helps you to identify things and isolate them so you can experiment upon them independently. So you can understand sheep, you can understand cows, as opposed to things in a meadow. Okay, and that gives you leverage to be able to categorize, to classify things. So what Aristotle did was he liked to do reduction, or there's a strategy of reduction, which is to break reality into smaller parts. And this is also dangerous because it may be that the cow being in the field with the sheep has got some benefit. You know, it may be that the cows, you know, when a predator comes along, the cow runs up and is big and large and massive and confuses the predator, and the predator leaves the sheep alone. I don't know. There may be some benefits, but what happens is in the process of reduction, you isolate things so that you can understand them independently. So the example here is a type of phenomenon might be a dog. You look at its qualities and behaviors. It has color, it barks. And then what happens in a situation? Fido at night. What's Fido at night going to do? Okay, now the color doesn't make a difference. Barking does make a difference. Okay, so this is the value of this process, is that you can figure out what makes a difference in what situations. And you can ignore everything else. And that gives you an enormous amount of leverage in terms of implementing change in the world. So where this really had value in ancient times was in ecology, which is related to survival through farming, through animal husbandry, through agricultural and things like that. And then the next step here was calculation. And Archimedes was really the exemplar of this in ancient Greece. There's other exemplars in other societies. I'm just trying to provide touch points, historical touch points, so people kind of knows what the age of these things are. And you know, so you look around the world and you can see certain kinds of things that, you know, if you make them simple enough, you can begin to try to calculate things about them. And so types of shapes might include triangles. You have concepts of mathematics, angles and lines, things that you can measure. How long is the line? How big is the angle? You know, and then what forms can we analyze? Right triangles. Okay, there are lots of things you can calculate about right triangles. And where this led in ancient times was to architecture. And this was incredibly important. The first societies were the hydrological societies, where you were able to move water over long distances in order to be able to create sustainable agriculture and to bring clean water and drinking water to cities and things like that. So the hydrological societies, this is where we were in problem solving at this stage of the scientific, this stage of physics. Okay. So having gotten to that point, there's some other really important problems that need to be solved because things change. And so prediction becomes important. And the history of astronomy here is kind of illustrative. Important issue with astronomy is navigation, knowing where you are as you move around in the world, particularly if you want to move long distances. And so there were a number of theories about how the universe was constructed. There was a heliocentric theory, which was Copernicus, and then there was Ptolemy, who had this idea that the Earth was the center of the universe because gravity, everything falls towards the Earth, so the Earth must be the center of the universe. Okay, and so what he said was that you can calculate all of the motions of all the stellar objects as wheels that had wheels on top of them. But the thing that we need to understand is that the reason that Ptolemy won was not because it was conclusive that he was right. It's because you can build little machines that are composed of wheels inside of wheels. They're called astrolabes and other kinds of navigational tools. Okay, and so these are only approximate. Okay, because what's really happening, as we learned from Kepler, is that planets have elliptical orbits and the sun's the center of the universe. But the reason why Kepler eventually was accepted was because the original calibration of the astrolabes was done by the Greeks, and it started going bad, and people couldn't navigate as well anymore. And they didn't have the wherewithal to do the design of, to do the recalibration and to design new astrolabes. So what ended up happening was that the resistance to adaptation of the new science of astronomy was not most strongly in the church. The church didn't really care as long as you didn't make fun of the church. Okay, it was from the navigators, because they knew how to operate these astrolabes, and you couldn't build an astrolabe with ellipses in it. Ellipses don't turn inside things, okay? Once you put an ellipse inside of its shape, it's something it's not going to turn. So what happened was that you had this new system. You had to train people to use lookup tables, and they had charts and books that you would use to look in and find the right entry to figure out where you were. And these things would be renewed consistently based upon what was now known about the elliptical orbits and how things worked. And the other thing was dynamics. Okay, this is things actually happening here on the Earth. And so you have Newton's 3 laws, which led to gravity and understanding of the motion of the arcs of things flying through the air. Friction, the weight of something as it's dragged along the surface, and the friction, all that kind of stuff came from Newton's laws. And then eventually you had Maxwell with electromagnetism and thermodynamics. He was the one who kind of put the fundamental ideas that were being involved by other physicists together in their kind of modern formulation. And where this led to is industry. So again, we're trying to solve specific, meaningful human problems. And then you get to modern physics. And in modern physics, you see something happening which is very similar to what happened with ideas, which is that the driving principle in modern physics is a concept called symmetry. And symmetry is an abstraction, but it can be realized mathematically fairly directly. If you can find kind of a way of changing your perspective on how the world operates, not as somebody who's actually interacting with it, but who's just looking at it from outside in a different way, okay, then that should be considered as being important in terms of the way that the theory is constructed. So the symmetry in relativity is that no observer has a privileged perspective. Now, you know that, for example, just to understand why this is meaningful, you know that if you're in a boat and you're motoring into the chop, you're going to get bounced up and down a lot harder than you are if you're motoring with the chop. Okay, and so when in relativity Einstein made this statement that no observer had a privileged perspective, it meant that if people are moving, somebody moving and somebody who looks like they're standing still, okay, they should be able to use the same laws of physics. And if they run the same experiment, you know, one sitting still and one moving on a train, they should get the same result. Okay, as long as the train is moving smoothly enough, as long as there's no bumping on the train. Okay, but in principle, just moving doesn't change the laws of physics at all, or just change your experience of reality, I should say. And the other thing that's very important about this is the way that this is implemented in relativity is that space is empty and perfectly smooth. Fundamentally, and once you move everything out of the way, you get to a place where space, there's no matter in it. Space itself is perfectly empty and perfectly smooth. So that leads off into gravity, theories of gravity and things like that. And then there's a concept of gauge invariance. And in gauge invariance, everything is about shape and topologies and things moving and interacting with each other in kind of a very continuous, smooth fashion. And what's important in this view of reality is they're trying to unify all the forces and make them completely interchangeable. And we know of 4 forces: gravity, electromagnetism, the weak, and the color theory. And one of the things that happens as you're trying to unify these theories is you introduce a lot of extra complexity. And And there's this very important principle in most theories, scientific theories, which is called Occam's razor, which is that if you have two theories that explain the same phenomenon, the simpler one is to be preferred. And what happened when you went into gauge invariance and tried to unify all these forces is you just threw that principle out. Okay, I just want to lump everything together, and I don't care if I get a whole bunch of extra physics out of it that I can't see. The way that they deal with this in these theories, they simply make that physics happen at very, very high energies where it's not part of our everyday experience anymore. They just make it go away and disappear at very high energies. Okay, we live in a very cold, safe world, but and so all this other stuff disappears up at those very high energies. It isn't part of our daily experience. So that's how they deal with that. But what it means is that there's a lot of stuff in these theories that we'll never verify experimentally. When I was in graduate school and they started talking about these superstring theories, they had this picture of the machine that they would build. They would allow particles to achieve enough energy that you could smash things together and see these fundamental, these initial very powerful states of reality. And it was basically a linear accelerator like they have at Stanford, superimposed upon the galaxy. Okay, that's how big the machine would have to be to smash things together to manifest the kinds of phenomena that are predicted by these theories. So we're never going to see them. Okay, so that's where we're at. So now you understand intellectually how we got to where we go, and you see a lot of parallels between these two journeys. Okay, there was the beginning, this concern, one in the spirituality side with existing and coexisting with energies and forces which are implemented biologically and very powerful primitive urges for survival and procreation. Okay, and it moved up and became more and more personalized. That's a universal thing for all animals, but it moved up, became more and more specific to human beings, and then it became completely abstract, where we have sometimes trouble even understanding how they apply to human beings anymore in any kind of really meaningful way. Same thing happened in physics. Okay, it began looking at very basic problems in terms of helping people survive and enabling them to have more control over food supply and things like that, and water. It became more about redesigning the reality that we're in with industry, and then it went off completely into the space of abstraction. So the two journeys actually have a lot of common. Okay, so now we're going to look at the standard model, and we're going to ask, I'm going to look at it from the perspective of saying, how solid is it? Okay, so I'm not going to explain the theories in detail. I'm going to characterize them and look at some of the significant phenomena. Okay, but our goal here is to understand, how, whether or not we're convicted that all the pieces fit together. Okay, so I'm going to be poking holes at this and talking about some of the challenges that even physicists have. Quantum mechanics, most physicists don't understand quantum mechanics. And it's a sad thing, but they say lots of crazy things, and those crazy things, the people that are interested in spirituality, because the physicists don't understand what they're talking about, they say these crazy things, and the people interested in spirituality say, oh, well, yeah, that's kind of like our spiritual experience. Okay, so maybe quantum mechanics and spirituality go together. So part of what I'm doing here is I'm going to poke holes in the common things that people say about quantum mechanics that lead people to believe that it actually explains spirituality, because it absolutely does not. Okay, so foundations of relativity. Albert Einstein, most brilliant scientist, physicist of the 20th century, still unchallenged today, and even getting people to talk about overthrowing his theories, they kind of roll their eyes at you, just what you're comparing yourself to Einstein. Okay, but let's just back up a little bit from Einstein. So I talked about Maxwell with the theory of electromagnetism, and in 1860s he published a paper that said that light is a wave. And we know that like water waves travel in water and sound waves travel in air. So the natural question that Maxwell had is there a medium? And they called it the ether. Is there a medium that light travels in, just like water waves travel in the water and sound travels in the air? So there was an experiment that was done in America. This is probably one of the first great contributions of American science to physics, is that they set up a device which tried to measure, which was able to measure, is the Earth was moving around the sun. Okay, so you have this ether which fills all of space, and the light's moving through it. The Earth is moving through it, and the idea was, the simplest idea was that the ether didn't move with the Earth. And so as you're moving around the sun, this apparatus, it's measuring the speed in a certain specific direction on the Earth. If the ether existed, then it's just like the boat in the chop. Okay, if you're moving towards the light, if you're moving, towards the light, it should speed up, and if you're moving with the light, it should slow down. Okay, and they saw no effect. Speed of light did not change at all. Okay, so what they realized is that a stationary and incompressible ether is impossible. And so the easiest, simplest way of achieving that is just to say there's no ether. Space is empty and no observer is privileged. And this is exactly where Einstein went. Now we know that there's a counterexample to this. Sound is also a phenomenon on the Earth, and it doesn't change speed when you go around the sun, because the air is carried with the Earth. And people looked at this idea very, very carefully. And what's not taught in the physics textbook is that there was a theory by Coudray and Wien in 1900 that said if the ether is compressed and distorted by mass, you can explain all of the experimental observations. But this was very complicated. So they used Occam's razor, and they just said it's far easier to just assume that space is empty. So let's just forget about this. And they did. But wait a minute. You get to Einstein's general relativity, and he says mass distorts the fabric of space. Okay. And then the Nobel Prize in 2011, you had a Nobel Prize for discovery of a compressible ether called dark energy. They actually awarded a Nobel Prize for it. They're saying that there's something that's distorting, that's bending light as it moves through empty space. So as we've marched forward, people haven't gone back and looked at Coudray and Wien. They're still resting upon this Michelson-Morley in the initial interpretation, the one interpretation that Einstein adopted. But in fact, there's more recent observations that say that there is an ether. And part of them, one of them is Einstein, one way of interpreting Einstein's general relativity is actually that the fabric of space is the ether. And Einstein knew this. I had a professor who studied with him when I was in college, and Einstein said he included an ether term in his original general relativity theory because at the time that he wrote the theory, they thought that the universe wasn't expanding. And the only way to make the universe not expand was to include an ether term. And what happened was that when Hubble discovered that space was expanding, he was really relieved that he could get rid of that term, because what that means is that the ether can't be moving in all possible directions at all possible speeds. And so that means it establishes a preferred rest frame. The observer that's sitting still in the ether has a privileged experience of reality. And anyone who's moving, his experience of reality can be biased by the existence of the ether. And so what this means is that relativity is undermined by general relativity itself and by this Nobel Prize in 2011. Okay, but we have this objection. Okay, let's say that there is an ether. We know that the air slows things that move through it. Why doesn't the ether slow things that move through it? So there's a class of things. One of the things you know about space is it's very, very cold. There's a class of fluids called superfluids. And the most typical one is liquid helium. You have an extremely cold liquid in the container. There's no place for the liquid to go. And now you have an impurity moving through the container, and it pushes the liquid helium around and behind it, and then liquid helium fills in behind of it and comes back into rest again. And the only way it can come back to rest again is to give its energy back to the impurity. And so in liquid helium, you will have objects moving through liquid helium that maintain their velocity, just like they're moving through empty space. And so one way of dealing with this is to say that the ether is a superfluid. So we can also solve that problem. Okay, now let's look at this other supposition, which is in both quantum mechanics and relativity, which is that everything is smooth. This is a mathematical convenience because it allows us to use some very powerful mathematical tools called calculus and differential equations. But beyond that, what it allows us to use is a technique called Fourier analysis, which says that everything oscillates. And what you see here is that you can have kind of a very complicated kind of a shape, which could represent a water wave. And you can break this down into shapes that have perfectly regular oscillations that are moving, that have different lengths to their oscillations. And in quantum mechanics, what happens is that the rate at which the object is moving up and down, both in time and in distance, corresponds to how fast it's moving. So the more oscillations you have, the faster your particle is moving. So this is now the concept of wave-particle duality, okay, which is that a particle moving through space has got oscillations, okay, but ultimately it can only end up in one place. But we can calculate its properties based upon assuming that it's just these perfectly smooth oscillating waves. There's no reason why this should be fundamental. And in fact, when you get close to where interesting things are happening, Fourier analysis is a really bad way of doing analysis. It only works when you're really far away from where interesting things are happening. And so what ends up is that Fourier analysis becomes a limiting perspective as to how we understand what's going on. And this is important, okay? The mathematics that people are using to analyze these perfectly smooth theories actually biases the way that they understand what's happening when things that are interesting are happening. Now, general relativity, you see this in terms, there's been some recent announcements about gravity waves and things like that, which is a very long field phenomenon. So Fourier analysis works really well there. But in general relativity in general, you can only solve very, very simple problems. And quite often you can only solve them approximately, even though you have these very powerful tools, okay? There's certain issues, like when you get to the surface of an object, okay? There's certain things to go in there that are called boundary matching conditions, and it can be really hard to make the equations be smooth when you've got a boundary of some kind to actually behave properly mathematically, so that everything stays smooth. Okay, so in general relativity, we can only solve very simple problems. In quantum mechanics, this emphasis on Fourier analysis leads to some really interesting statements about quantum mechanics. So the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, you can't know everything about what's happening, everything that a particle is doing. The most famous, the way that this actually manifests mostly is that if you try to keep a particle in one place, it begins to oscillate and vibrate a lot. And so you don't know how fast it's going. You don't know what its momentum is, okay? Because it's constantly interacting with the container that you're putting in it. And that interaction mixes things up and changes its velocity all the time. So you actually don't know how fast it's moving. The more tightly you hold it in place, okay? The other one is that if you try to know exactly what time it is, you don't know how much energy it has, because you have to use a very, very, very high energy photon to get to that exact specific time. And that means that that photon is going to disrupt its movements. Okay, so but this primarily comes from Fourier analysis. Okay, that's where you get this justification from Fourier analysis. You get this concept of, yes, you can have this concept of a particle being a wave and it's distributed all over the place, but we know that at the end, the particle only ends up in one place. And so that means you've got this interesting concept of a wave function collapse, where you never know where the particle is until actually something happens. And then the wave function collapses and there you are in that specific place. And this leads to really interesting things like Schrodinger's cat, and whether the cat's alive and whether the observer affects the system, and all kinds of very obscure concepts like that. And this is a lot of where the confusion with quantum mechanics comes in. is distinguishing between the two kinds of randomness that exist in the world, some of which is quantum and some of which is just, classical. You can take a deck of cards and shuffle it up and you're going to get different hands, okay, every time. There's randomness in the world besides quantum mechanical randomness, and there's a lot of confusion in the physics community about separating out, when doing quantum mechanical calculations, separating out the randomness due to wave functions and the randomness that's just randomness in the world, because you can't control the initial conditions. The one that a lot of people refer to when they're talking about physics and spirituality, quantum mechanics and spirituality, is that a measurement in one place affects another measurement. This is the principle of entanglement. But what you end up with when you actually try to apply quantum mechanics is that as people were evolving these theories, they made some simplifying assumptions. And they came up with these principles like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, wave function collapse, and entanglement, and all these things like that, before really the rigorous mathematical definition of quantum mechanics was established. And all this stuff has been carried forward. And so we're going to talk about sloppy calculations. We're going to do an example of that, which is this two-slit experiment on the right-hand side. But you also get infinities. So when I was studying particle physics, you would introduce this raw mass into your calculations, and you would the raw charge, and you would do your calculations, and you would have infinities. So you would divide the infinities out, and you would collect them together, and you would say, this raw mass has got this infinity divided by that infinity, and that must end up with the mass that we observe. And so you would just factor out all these infinities that you're getting. The calculations, because you are assuming that everything is smooth, and you're using Fourier analysis, the calculations just spewed infinities out everywhere. Not a very happy situation. And everybody just covered us up. They didn't talk about how shaky these theories are. How they really, when you get down close, that smoothness is really a bad thing. It just leads to bad results. But let's turn now and let's look at this thing of this two-slit experiment. So this is a situation where you have an electron and you have two masks. The electron comes through one mask, and because you're squeezing it in place, that means that its velocity begins to spread out in that direction. So the electron's moving through, and then it comes through and it begins to spread out. And then there's two slits in the second screen. And now the electron wave is spreading out twice now through these two slots, because you don't know which one the electron's going through. It's the wave that's moving through. What happens is that on the far side, there's a screen where you actually have a detector, which is measuring where the electron ends up. And the waves, just like with classical water waves, if you have like drop two pebbles into a pool where there's no ripples, you'll see the waves interacting with each other. Okay, and that's exactly what you end up happening. You have very high parts and very low parts, where the high parts of the waves come together and very low parts of the low parts come together. And you can actually even get the waves to cancel out. Okay, is to where the high part and the low part come together and they cancel each other out. Well, that's what's happening downstream of these two slits. And so you don't get the smooth distribution of electron observations. You get bands, discrete bands on the screen. And what they say is that the electron's interfering with itself. Okay, now the issue here though is, wait a minute, this electron is moving. Now, what if we do what Einstein said? What if we decide we're going to move along with the electron? Now the electron isn't moving. Now it doesn't have any bumps in it. It's just smooth. It's just flat, uniform everywhere. The Fourier waveform for a particle that isn't moving is just flat. Okay, it could be anywhere. So what happens is that there's no bumps to interfere with each other. So this looks like, wow, we're in this situation where quantum mechanics violates relativity. That's not good. Okay, but go forward, and what you see is that to do a quantum mechanical calculation right, actually, you don't know what electron. There's a lot of electrons in this system, right? Because these screens, they're not just like these solid things with perfectly sharp edges and stuff like that. They've got electrons in them. And what it says is that in quantum mechanics, you don't know what electron you're observing. It could be any one of these electrons. So to do this calculation, you actually have to write a description of the system which includes all of the electrons, every single last one. So now if you're sitting here and you're moving along with this electron, the electrons in the screens are moving. and they have that same oscillation in them that the first electron had from that electron's perspective. And so it's by considering the interchangeability of all the electrons, what actually turns out is that where this ripple is in the relative velocity between the electron that's moving through the system and the electrons in the screen. And then you get special relativity back. However, nobody does the calculation this way. They don't even talk about this. They just say wave particle duality. They say the electron's interfering with itself. When in point of fact, the electron is interfering with every other electron in the system. All the electrons are interfering with each other. Okay, and to get the right answer from a relativistic perspective, you have to consider all of the electrons. So now where's the wave particle duality? Where's the particle? You got all these particles. Okay, so we're just poking holes at this logic, and I'm just letting you know that there's a lot of inconsistency here. There's a lot of approximations. And so when you hear people talk about quantum mechanics, 99.99% of physicists will get this wrong. Okay, so let's poke a little bit at the history of everything is smooth, because this has been going on for a long time. You know, you had the four elements, and they were considered to be kind of indivisible, no smaller pieces kinds of stuff. And then we ended up realizing that, you know, you can actually separate things out. You can like smelt ore, and you can get copper and iron, and these are different substances. And, you know, you can tell by the kind of ore what you're going to get as a metal. So that broke down, and they came up with the periodic table of the elements. Okay, that actually all these things are made up of atoms. Okay, and then we realized that there's stuff inside of atoms, electrons and a nucleus with protons and neutrons. And then you look inside the protons and neutrons, and you see quarks and gluons. So we know that water seems smooth until you look closely. And this is actually what Einstein won. One of the reasons why Einstein won his Nobel Prize. He did not win Nobel Prize for relativity. It was too controversial at the time. He won this for giving proof that water is composed of smaller parts, and you could actually observe it through a microscope. And what it turns out is that when physics is having problems, it always solves its problems by coming up with smaller parts. Today, the smallest known parts are called fermions. So the question, when I began to have my spiritual experiences, the first place I said is, what if fermions had parts? What if there's something inside of fermions? Okay, now let's go to the other end. Let's get the really, really large. Everybody talks about the Big Bang and everything like that. Unfortunately, the Big Bang is no longer the reigning theory of how the universe is created. And the best analogy that I can give you for the current models of how the universe is created is an ice cube forms in boiling water. This is really what the theory states, okay, effectively. Now, what happens is the universe is unfolding. This little ice cube is unfolding. It's not a solid. It's still a really hot gas, okay, but it's cooling down inside this thing that's even hotter. Okay, what happens is it's cooling down is the speed of light slows down. Because there's so much, it's like the universe in that super hot place, it's like a violin string that's screwed up really, really, really super tight. So when you know that as you screw up and make a violin string tighter, the pitch goes up, okay, and it vibrates faster. Okay, so what's happening is the universe is cooling down, is that the space is beginning to relax and become softer. And the way that manifests is that the speed of light slows down. Okay, now the thing is that in this superheated thing that we start from, there's a lot of turbulence going on in there, obviously, and our universe is really, really smooth. So you have to figure out how much does the speed of light have to slow down so that you don't see any evidence, so that the part of the universe that we're in is so small in terms of the universe, that superheated thing, that we don't see any disturbances from that universe that we came from, that superheated thing that we came from, okay? And in order to make the universe as smooth as we see it, the speed of light has to slow down a million times from its original speed. It's huge, okay? This is how they think about this happening though. Once the slowing down happens, then what happens is you begin to have matter created. Then you've got to have galaxies that are formed and everything like that. Everything follows after that. But this is all based upon this idea that the speed of light slows down enormously as the universe cools down. And our universe is only one of millions of possibilities, it turns out, in this view of reality. Okay. Now, this is not easy. It's not easy to make this happen because space is smooth. And normal space, in our three-dimensional space, if you try to have three-dimensional space form directly, if the super hot thing was actually in a three-dimensional space, you would end up with lots of black holes and other nasty things that we don't see. The universe will be a very lumpy place with lots of sharp things in it, okay? And what we see is that space is smooth. So what they had to do in order to get it so that the universe would form in a way where it's smooth, which is what we see, okay, at least the level that we look at it now, is you have to have extra spatial dimensions. You have to have 7 extra directions. And these wrap up and go away because it takes too much energy to move it to them as they're cooling down. Okay, they just go away. We don't see them anymore. Even when that happens, the gas that's created in the early universe, it's very smoothly distributed. That means it doesn't clump together very fast. And it turns out you can't get the galaxies to come together fast enough according to what we're observing. We can actually see when galaxies are forming. So they introduced something called dark matter. But on top of that, the galaxies are clumped together into bigger formations. So you need even a different kind of dark matter. So they're just adding stuff on top of adding stuff. Now, inside of every single galaxy, you have supermassive black holes. They formed 10 billion years ago. They're at the center of every single galaxy. But what happens is that if you have gas that's coalescing together, it should come together and it's distributed uniformly. It should come together and it should kind of make a round thing in the center. We know black holes get created. It's not a big complex thing, but they're usually round. But what happens is here's a picture of what's going on in the X-ray spectrum inside the center of our galaxy. This is only in 1 light year, which is really, really small in galactic terms. From our sun to the nearest star is almost five light years, okay, in terms of a distance unit. And you look at this thing and it's very, very complex. It is not a simple shape at all, which means that it's got a lot of structure to it. So how did you get this structure? From a universe that started off very, very smooth. How does this happen? Okay. So one of the things that you get is you look at this whole story here, and you look at the way that they go about. As I follow this process and I'm understanding the steps they're taking, they're just making it up as they go along. They're just introducing things to fit the data. There is no overriding set of principles. And they actually like this. They like confusing situations because it gives theorists something to do, and it creates mysteries that you can spend billions of dollars building machines to investigate. So let's talk about a specific case of that, the Higgs boson. The subtitles say it all. Okay, so we were talking about fermions. Okay, so it turns out that there's 2 kinds of fermions, leptons and quarks. And the quarks, the leptons have got integral charge, 0 and -1. The quarks have fractional charge, -1/3 and 2/3. And so we've got this family, which is the lowest energy. And this is what makes up all the matter we see. Electrons and up and down quarks. These are the things that make up protons and neutrons. So this is all that we need to understand what's going on in the world around us day to day. But what happens is physicists smash these things together with things called accelerators. And when they do, they discover these other particles, which seem to be heavier versions, and they come in families. Okay, the muon, the strange, and the charm particle. And then the heaviest ones are the tau on the bottom and the top particle. And these particles, they don't seem to have any mass. They seem to travel at the speed of light. But these particles, the masses tend to go up as you go from here to here, and they increase as you go from family to family. Okay, so this is what fermions look like. Now, as you go and you're studying these things and you begin to smash things together, you get some really interesting things. You know, you got a lot of energy involved. You can make a lot of up and down electrons and photons and things like that when you're smashing things together, this kind of energy. So you end up with signals that look like this. Just a whole bunch of stuff. It looks like just a huge explosion. And part of the challenge of high energy particle physics and why it costs so much is building detectors that can get enough information that you can actually figure out what's going on. Okay, so let's look at the quarks now. So we designed these machines to smash stuff together. We designed detectors to kind of get the signals out and figure out what's going on inside. And we have this history of measurements of the masses of the different quarks. Okay. And there's a certain machine power at which you can observe these things. Okay. There's this unit as kind of MEVs call it. It's really kind of arbitrary. So at a machine power of about 270, you can see the up and down quarks. And the signal that they have, it's a 2-photon signal, back-to-back photons, and a 3-photon signal. We got the 3 photons going on like they're going on the points of an equilateral triangle. And this is the signal. We understand why this signal is there, and it makes perfect sense why this is happening. So then they got up to 2000, and they saw the strange particle, 2-photon, 3-photon, all good. Charm particle around 6000, 2-photon, 3-photon, all good. Bottom particle around 19,000, 2-photon, 3-photon, all good. So every single detector that they build, one of the primary considerations is that it has to be able to detect these 2-photon and 3-photon signals, and every particle detector everywhere. So I'm in graduate school, my last year of graduate school in 1987, and they announced the top particle, and they say it's 346,000, but it doesn't have 2-photon and 3-photon. Okay. And I went and I talked to somebody about this. This doesn't make any sense. Okay, how can this be? You know, this is just the way that things work in this world. Okay, you got to have 2 photons and 3 photons. I even told them there's another kind of particle called a boson, and there's a W boson and a Z boson. The thing about bosons, you can make as many of them as you want when you smash things together. You can't. It's not just making one. Okay, you can make as many of these as you want. And the W has a mass of 83,000. The Z has a mass of 90,000. If you made 2 W's and 2 Z's, you get 346,000. And you don't get 2 photons and 3 photons. You get a big mess, which is what they were saying the top particle was. And I told them this. Okay. So now look at this. 25 years later, you get the Higgs particle. The machine power at this point in time, 25 years later, it was not just 346,000. It was like 20 million. It was huge. And they built this machine. And they ratcheted up from 1 million, and they carefully went through and just stepped the machine up to higher and higher and higher power, and they saw nothing. Nothing that was involved. It was just random garbage. They saw nothing for a year. Then they finished that scan, and they went back, and they went directly to 125,000. And there's a 2-photon signal. They never reported on this signal. And they said, this is the Higgs particle. Now, the thing you got to remember is that every detector up to this point in time was capable of detecting the signal. This energy is less than this energy. That means in 1987, they already knew that this thing existed. There was no way possible that they did not know about this thing. So what was going on here? Okay, so let's just look at what happened. Let's just look at what happened in the year that the Higgs was discovered. So they announced at CERN, the one facility that can do these measurements. They announced the Higgs particle. Then the Nobel Committee got a hold of this and said, Peter Higgs, we're giving you the Nobel Prize. Carlo Rubbia, the director of CERN, the guy that was responsible for the machine construction and everything like that, and managing the facility and getting the funding for it, goes to that summer to a meeting and says, you know, this Higgs particle is kind of squirrely. It's not really what we expected at all, actually. You know, we want you to give us $10 billion for a bigger machine. The Nobel Committee gets a hold of this and goes, say what? Is this the Higgs particle or is this not the Higgs particle? We're about to give somebody a Nobel Prize. What is this we're hearing, Carlo? So Rubbia retracts the statement. The Nobel Prize is awarded. And 6 months later, CERN makes an announcement. It looks like a Techni Higgs. We need a new $10 billion machine. So one of the things that you have to understand about science, the way that the scientific method protects us from fraud and error is by cross-checking. It's by you publish your data and the initial conditions of your experiment in a way where somebody else can do that. No one else can check CERN. And what CERN is a $1 billion or $2 billion a year large-scale engineering project that uses cryogenics and electrostatic or electrodynamic amplification and power channeling technologies that aren't used anywhere else in the world. These are big fat contracts. And an interesting thing to read about is that there were people, when Ivan Boesky ran his $37 billion Ponzi scheme, there were people saying that Ivan Boesky was a fraud. But nobody would listen. And so Ivan Boesky burned up $37 billion with his Ponzi scheme. So the thing is, again, what I'm talking about is this is a situation where people are just doing this right out in the open. If you understand the history of particle physics and you understand what these numbers mean and you understand what the characteristics of these particles are, it is clear as day that this is a fraud. This is not possible. The Higgs particle had to have been known to exist at this energy. And what I think it really is I think it's the top particle. I don't think that this is a Higgs at all. I think that if you looked at this 3-photon signal, you'd see it. You wouldn't see it in the case of the Higgs. And this would actually be recognized as being the top particle. But Carlo Rubio won his Nobel Prize in 1987 for the discovery of the top particle. And the Nobel Committee is not about to back out on that award. So it's kind of locked in at this point in time. Okay, so that's a dark history. Sorry to drag you through that. Let me just check and make sure I know what time it is here. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time here. I'm gonna move through this a little bit more rapidly. So let's start. Let's now change our view of things. Let's say let's say that there is an ether. And we want to figure out how to construct this ether. Okay. So we're going to start with quanta, and I'm treating these as magnets, but these are all just toy models. Okay, don't think like this is the way the things actually work. I'm just trying to use your intuition. You know how magnets work. I'm trying to use your intuition for what you'd expect things to happen if you took this line of magnets, okay, and you started poking it against a wall. What's going to happen is that you're going to end up with the thing folding over, and the only stable shapes that you're going to get that are left behind are triangles, squares, pentagons, things like they'll all collapse into more simple, like either lines or triangles. Okay, and so what happens is that you can take this 1D reality made up of quanta, and you can actually think about making a 2-dimensional reality, which is a plane that's tiled with triangles. Now, let's say you have these triangles and you push them into a wall. What's going to happen is that the triangles are going to begin to buckle and stick up into a 3rd dimension. And so what you end up with is a little thing that looks like this. So instead of you having a triangle in 3 dimensions, to have a 3-dimensional object, you have 3 triangles. And the 3 triangles, one way that you can think about them coming together, and these colors are arbitrary, is in a lattice, a rectangular lattice, because you can see on each direction, here's the red direction, oops, sorry. On the red direction, you have a straight line. On the blue direction, you have a straight line. And on the green direction, you have a straight line. So you have X, Y, and Z in a Cartesian system. And this is what Einstein tells us in general relativity. Locally, space is always Cartesian. You always have these 3 directions. Fundamental in Einstein's theory. Space is locally flat. Okay, so these unit cells, if they're stiff enough, you can stick them together, okay, and stack them up in all different directions to make this kind of like nice lattice moving in all directions through space. But if you stress the lattice, you can bend it. But the individual cells aren't going to bend. It's only going to be the lattice that's going to bend a little bit. We're going to create some extra space between things. Okay, now we add stretchy loops. We're going to look in 2 dimensions. So you add stretchy loops. Now the thing is, you add this stretchy loop, and then what's going to happen is it's got to have some space too, right? It's got to have some space to fit in. And that's going to distort the lattice. So what this means is that the lattice, since it's bounded around by walls in all directions, okay, at the edge, there's no place for it to go. So you have to kind of squeeze things together somehow. And it's going to want to come back to its regular state without the loop being in that place. Okay, it's going to try to squeeze back in. What that means is the more loops you stuff in there, the more energy you store in the lattice. It's like blowing into a balloon. So here's where spirituality comes in. Complex configurations of these stretchy loops in the lattice are what we call spirit. And they can be pure souls, where they aren't connected to the lattice at all, except for, by being kind of like hanging on it. Okay, but they're not tied into any one of the little triangles anywhere. Okay, so that's souls, angels, demons, and ghosts. You have incarnations, which are living creatures, okay, where they're actually bound into matter, where the threads run through matter. And we'll talk about what matter is in just a little bit. Okay, and then you have pure ideas, which are things that we create in our minds and project into the world around us, and human beings share them. Okay, and we throw our loops. This is why we have spirituality, is the negotiation of the boundaries between I and we. We throw our loops into the world, we throw them over other objects. So when you take your hands and you reach over and you hug somebody, what you are doing is you are casting your loops over them. And they can figure out, because you can't tie the loops to them, they either can accept those loops and integrate them into their matter, in which case they're giving you permission to know what's happening inside their bodies. And that's where a lot of healing intuition comes in spirituality. Or they can choose to slip away and, go swimming or something like that and get your loops off of them. They can choose to just let your loops slide off of them. So spirituality is the negotiation of the interaction between I and we. Now, if you can get the loops attached to these little triangles, just where they run through the little triangles, this is what we call fermions. This is our matter. So here's a neutrino. It's moving through the lattice. It's a lattice cell moving through the lattice itself, but it doesn't have any loops attached to it. You have an electron, this one where every single triangle has a loop in it. And then you have two quark states, one of which there's only one triangle with a loop, and one of which there's two triangles with a loop. Now the thing is that these generations, there's no explanation for them in modern theories of physics. You just put them in manually. But if you think about banging on these little structures here, you can see a situation where only one of the triangles stays closed and the other two join together, and this opens up. And as this is moving through the lattice, it's going to create more distortion in the lattice. It's going to create more disturbance. So it's going to cause the lattice to mix around more. That's what mass is. The more you cause the lattice to mix around and be disturbed as you're moving through it, the higher your mass is. And there's a third configuration in which all of the triangles are opened up. And there's only three. So what this says is there should be three families and only three families. This actually gives extra content. This is explaining something that modern physics can't explain. Okay, so now let's put science into its place. It studies only the parts of reality that lack the free loops of personality. It uses intensely destructive methods. And if you were a soul, why in the name of all that is sacred would you hang around to be torn apart by scientists? If you can get out of the way, you would get the frick out of the way. So the corollary is science can neither prove nor disprove spirituality. And the axiom that I have been living for the last 20 years is accepted spirituality is actually essential to understanding and making scientific progress. So let's just now review the spiritual principles. If you have spirit and it's indestructible, there's an evolutionary proof that unconditional love is the most powerful spiritual structure. So what love does is it joins other spirits in marvelous relationships. Fundamentally, love is a it's a relational principle. The things that makes it different from every other relational principle is that it's trying to create marvelous relationships where the two participants in the relationship both benefit. So the advantage of that is it liberates energy from protection for collaboration. And it facilitates journeys into creative possibilities. You don't pass judgment on what love brings to you. You look at it and you say, okay, thank you, love. Let me see what I can do with this. Now, the thing about unconditional love is it wants nothing for itself, so it cannot be corrupted. You can never get unconditional love to hurt something that it loves. It's not possible. It'll just move away. So selfish spirits are disciplined. If they want to take advantage of something that unconditional love has got in its shelter, they're disciplined because unconditional love shields the humble that aren't selfish in the witness of their partners. So humble things join together and bear witness to each other, and love shields them. Love strengthens them and enables them to preserve each other. And if the predator decides that it's going to come in and try to blow things up anyways, what love will do and force itself into love, what love will do is just reach into it and liberate whatever the predator has captured. So a predator, in trying to attack the domain of unconditional love, actually destroys itself as unconditional love becomes more and more powerful and more deeply embedded in the reality that it helps to manage. So recognizing the value of diversity, all spirits joined under the compact of unconditional love sing its praises, calling others to participate. So this is the evolutionary proof. In the spiritual realm, unconditional love is the most powerful principle, precisely because it wants nothing for itself. Okay, so now let's think about life and death. We can't tie loops together. So in principle, we can always escape from pain if we choose to. Something that's trying to prey upon us to steal our energy, we can always choose to escape from the pain. That may mean giving up our body, because our loops aren't tied to our bodies, they're just embedded in them. The thing is that if somebody gets themselves really deeply invested in material things, they're winding their loops up in those things. They're tying their loops to all those things. And it takes energy to pull them through after you've gotten them all tangled up and wrapped around these things that you've been investing yourself in. Okay. So what happens is when you die, you can't get all your loops back. They're not tied together. They get pulled apart. And we talk about people like this is one of the things that used to be said is that he's generating more heat than light. This also happens when somebody comes into the room with just demanding attention and talking loudly and everything like that. Okay, you can feel the heat in your body when somebody like that comes into the room, as opposed to somebody who's very calm, looks at the situation and comes up and tells you exactly what you need to know. They're giving you a gift. And the corollary here is really have pity on the rich. Okay, they are their own worst enemies. They just don't know it. So now, the Gnostic truth, then, given these two principles, given these two realities, okay, of unconditional love being the most powerful spiritual structure, of the fact that hanging on to objects and being selfish is self-destructive. Let's now get to the Gnostic truth. Why is this reality the way that it is? So the cosmic mind that designed this reality, the purpose that this reality was designed to fulfill, is infinitely enamored of the potentiality of living things. Think about it. Stars take millions of years to evolve. Planets take thousands of years to evolve. Animals take lifetimes to evolve. Intelligent creatures evolve every day. Tool makers evolve every minute. I reach out and I grab my mouse and I become a different being. I'm capable of doing things I'm not capable of otherwise. And love wants this. Love loves diversity. It loves possibilities. every single one of us represents something unique. And love cherishes us for that. But it's also inexorably destructive of selfish personalities. And there's a paradox here, because being in a body means latching on to physical stuff. And it's really attractive because it gives us a chance to evolve our souls. Souls get kind of stuck things inside of them too, and sometimes you got to move things out. So what bodies do is they give us a chance to practice joining and separation and relationships and sharing spiritual parts of ourselves and moving them around and borrowing from other people and, you know, and other forms of life and things like that. And so being incarnate is really a pretty cool thing to do. It allows you to be yourself and to work on yourself. And love doesn't object to that. The other advantage of this situation is that matter is dense. As you say, you can always withdraw your loops inside of your body. And a lot of what happens when people get to be traumatized is they're spending all their energy trying to do that. They're trying to keep their loops inside of their bodies, which is why they tend to not look around and interact with the world around them. Okay. But the other thing is that can be used in a manipulative way. You know, we can hide from our obligations. We come into the world together as gestalts. We're bound up with other souls. Sometimes we come in as parents, sometimes we come in as children, sometimes we come in as men, sometimes we come in as women. Maybe sometimes we come in as a pet. But we can withdraw and hide from our obligations to those that we're on a journey with, that we're doing some work together to work out some kind of disharmonious configuration in our souls. We can hide from our obligations. We can also lay traps for others. We can promise them something and we can throw our will over them and squeeze them up against something. And it's harder for them to get away from that. But matter is a honeypot. Ultimately, when we die, we got loops stuck in stuff, we lose them. Okay, so the question, there's two big doubts in spirituality. One of them is the scientific doubt, and I hope that I have annihilated that in your minds today. Okay. Science has nothing to say about spirituality. And in fact, when I put spirituality into my models of physics, I came to see how things that physicists can't explain can be explained. But the other one is, why does love hurt so much? If the cosmic mind cares so much about us, why does it allow terrible things to happen to good people? Okay. And the only answer that I have for this, and this comes from a past life regression experience, is the initial conditions were really terrible. They were really bad. That this reality was established to contain a rampant infection of selfishness. And so the initial spiritual configuration was very disharmonious. But this reality is a hospital, not a prison. And our spiritual avatars all talk about this, that there's conditions under which we return to that realm of love. And that the will of love permeates this place, but it does not have complete sway here. And the reason why is that in order to remove the selfishness that's wrapped up in spirits that are contained here, it would have to tear everything apart. And so it just has to suffer along with us as we try to disentangle ourselves. So Buddha was right. Pain is a signal that we should change. But suffering arises when we refuse to let go. That's attachment. There are times when we need to let go of things that we believe are part of us, that are part of our souls. And Jesus was right. The way that we heal the world is we call unconditional love into the world, love God, and love your neighbor. Use it to strengthen others, and then you receive their gratitude, and they strengthen you. The important thing that I tell all of my clients at some point in time, whether they're religious or not, is that I love you is 3 nouns. I see you, beautiful, cherished spirit. I see the beauty in you. Love, come down and strengthen and amplify the presence of this beautiful being in the world so that everyone sees them the way that I see them. You just let it go. You just let it go. It's a blessing. You don't expect anything in return. And what happens is that person goes out into the world and comes back to you and says, wow, thank you. That was so wonderful. I love you too. And we amplify each other. That's the compact of this place. So that's the presentation. This is, I wore a dress shirt today. It should be an indication this is the most important presentation I think that I have to offer to the world. My work as a hypnotherapist and my motivations for becoming a hypnotherapist are actually contained inside of this. I became a hypnotherapist so that I could express this knowledge in some way to the world. And at this point in time, if you look at that picture back on that slide of how spirit distorts space-time, this was demonstrated in an experiment called the Parallax Experiment, which is you have 2 stars in space and you can measure the angle between them. And then those stars, they identified stars that could be on the opposite sides of the sun during a total solar eclipse. And so they measured the angle of those stars during a total solar eclipse, and they appeared to be farther apart because the light from the stars went around the sun that was coming in and bent more as it went around the sun. So when you distort, this is what matter does. It distorts the fabric of space, and the fabric of space bends light. So one of the things that I want to leave you with is there's far more power than we need to solve the problems we have to solve. It's just that the sun has been pouring spiritual energy into the world for billions of years, and we just aren't powerful enough to create the distortion in space that's required to bend light away from the earth to keep it cool. We have to care about the trees. We have to care about the phytoplankton. We have to care about the worms. We have to care about it all. And when it all believes that we do care, it will collaborate with us in protecting us from being annihilated. And this is how we get through. This is the hope. To choose to love everything around us. To do what the Indians did. There's this beautiful story told by an Indian elder. The cattle ranchers were fed up with the prairie dogs in the Southwest because the cattle kept on stepping in the holes and breaking their legs, and they would have to euthanize them, and it was just this real pain in the ass. So they decided to go out and to poison all the prairie dogs and get rid of them and fill in the holes and everything like that, so that they on their ranch land, so that the cows could graze safely. And the Indian elders went up to the ranchers and said, if you get rid of the prairie dogs, how will it rain? They just laughed at him. What a stupid idea. This has nothing to do with it. Well, what it turned out was, when they finally figured out what was going on, was that the prairie dogs created underground reservoirs. And when there was rain from one of the Gulf storms that came up into the Southwest, the water would run into the prairie dog holes. And then it would evaporate and create moisture in the atmosphere that would rise and come down again. So they finally figured this out. That by getting rid of the prairie dogs, they made drought in the Southwest. And the Indians knew this. They couldn't explain why. They just knew it. This is how things work. And what they say about us Europeans is we have to learn the hard way. So there's a lot of wisdom out there. And one of the things that as a Christian, I strongly advocate is that we've got to stop thinking that we're special. We have to love all of creation. And what Jesus said when he came down was, you know, God so loved the world. It was not God so loved mankind. It was not God so loved humanity. It was God so loved the world. And so this is the job. I see the job of Buddhism as being demon redemption. You know, those things that are afraid to enter into lives still need to be rescued. They still need to be ministered to. And if you read the stories of the Buddhist gurus, their greatest acts, most celebrated acts, are those of demon redemption. When they are assaulted by demons that try to corrupt their wisdom and their compassion, and they outlast them. And the demons become converted. They become liberated from their self-destructive tendencies. So, and then there's all the tribal religions, the tribal spirituality that still exists in the world. There are still places in the world where you can come in contact with these things. And one of the things that I said a decade ago in a spirituality forum, I said, when it gets to be too hard and you think you can't do it anymore, go find a place in nature that you love and sit there and offer yourself to it as its steward. Remember it so that we finally get ourselves under control. We can restore them. So where every rock, tree, every little thing is held in love. And that's the only choice that's available in front of us right now. And so what I'm doing is, I think that my generation is confused and lost. And it's not able to make the adaptation, but I hope that your generation and those that follow you will receive this wisdom. And if you find that this has been a valuable experience for you, please tell people. This will be up on my YouTube channel. Please ask them to come and listen, because I think it's really important. I don't think that there's a way out of the future that we're confronting using the methods that we're using now. We have to have a mind shift. So thank you very much, both of you, for attending here tonight. And are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if you wanted to be on the recording or not.
I can. It's up to you, really.
Yeah, I'm fine with it.
Okay.
It's I'm in agreement with everything that you're putting out there, and what you're saying. And so when I ask this question, it's not from a pessimistic viewpoint, but it's really a question. It's really a question that I have pondered a lot, as many people probably have. And it's that, you know, what, as far as like the universe, progress, I mean, even the movies that we've all seen and continue to be made with very little variations of what the future looks like, this kind of like a Jetsons kind of, you know, cities kind of built up in like these towers, and you never see trees or land or any of these natural resources anymore. Just even the history of the indigenous people and what we did coming to this world and this country, and even still how they are treated today. It seems almost like a snowball effect where it doesn't show any signs of slowing down. And so, this is where I don't want to come off pessimistic, but I want to understand, like, is there, does the snowball retreat, so to speak? Is there, even given what the generations that come after us learn, like, will it ever be too late? Is it already too late? Like, how do we, I know just from my experience, I know just from my intuition, that when things feel really off, like they did the last couple of days, I've been very stressed out. I could pinpoint why I was stressed out, but what was different was I acknowledged that I was acting out with my stress. Instead of handling it and coping, I wasn't having that. And I figured out a major component for myself and my kids was we hadn't been in nature in, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 days. I'm not sure, I lost count. When we went to the park yesterday, it recentered us. And most people don't kind of know what you just talked about, that it can recenter us. And have we gone too far? Are we going too far, down that path that you spoke about before, the loops and the materialism and all of that?
Right. 2 points. Our cities are actually a fairly small part of, the geography, and the it's certainly the case that if you look at organic matter production, 80% of the organic matter that's produced on land right now, both plant and animal, roughly, is allocated for human purposes. So we're having a major impact. But the thing is that in terms of the energetics of this system, it's still dominated by other forms of life. Now, we're operating in a realm which is unsustainable. So what's happening is that those other forms of life are being kind of decimated at this point in time. They're, forest fires and droughts and things like that. And, animals can't protect themselves from extreme flooding events and that kinds of business. And so it's a really bad situation. But the fact of the matter is, there's been some work done, which I'd be happy to talk to you about with you separately. Okay, this is not a random event. This is happening at the time that it's happening because the conditions are right. Okay, and I could share more about that with you offline. I don't want to talk about that here. But the thing is that the energetics and the spiritual energetics are still heavily weighted in the more primitive forms of life. And the sun has been fueling the investment of this planet with the personalities of those forms of life for 3 billion years. Let there be light was photosynthesis. It was not the Big Bang. Let there be light was photosynthesis. It's the first relationship of love. The sun shines and gets purpose by facilitating life and creating new forms, seeing its energy evolve into new forms. That's the first relationship of love here on the earth. That's been going on for billions of years now. We haven't been around that long. Okay, so even if we are changing the material circumstances quite dramatically, in terms of the spiritual energetics, there's just an enormous amount of spiritual energy stored in the crust of the earth and in the oceans and things like that, and in the moon. Okay, just enormous. Okay, so When I say that there's far more energy than we need to solve the problems we face, we're just not trusted to use it. I mean that. Okay. And so what ends up happening here is if you look at the great extinction episodes in paleontology, the kinds of phenomena that cause the extinction, trigger the extinction episodes happen all the time. What would happen is you'd see a little dip in the species density and things and the number of creatures and everything like that. And it would come back up again. And that was, you would see this huge extinction episode. The reason why the extinction episodes happened is because the forms of life that existed when the disaster occurred had completely occupied all the available ecological niches. They were highly optimized. And if you pulled one species, if one species went extinct in that system, it would just collapse. It was very fragile. So what that means is that the selfish creatures, the selfish personalities had completely occupied this material reality. And when they collapsed, love had an opportunity to enter in and create new forms until it created something that was intelligent. So what we're seeing right now is the last hurrah of selfishness. We have occupied the entire globe. And the peak predators, which are our oligarchs and things like that, okay, are running us around and biasing the system, tilting the playing field, so that we're spending all of our time just trying to figure out how to pay off our debts, much less have any joy. And that serves them fine. They're quite happy with that. But what happens is the system's collapsing. And they're the most vulnerable to collapse. The reason why the 1% don't want to pay more taxes is because they have to sell stock to do that. All their money is in this currency, this concept of currency. It's not stuff. They have to sell stock. Well, that's going to send the stock market down because there's no poor people left to buy the stock anymore. There's no middle class to buy the stock. So you tax them to pay the taxes, they got to sell stock. Well, the only thing you can do is they just hand the stock over to the US government. Well, actually, you know what? That's already happening. The Federal Reserve has taken upon itself the role of stabilizing our financial system. And after 2008, it bought trillions of dollars of stock, and it has continued to do that throughout COVID. Okay. It's all off-book deficit spending. And so what happens is when the stock market goes down, these people are going to get it the worst. Okay. And they don't know how to do anything. You know, they don't know how to rake a row. They're really superfluous. Okay, so the thing is to always remember that destruction, when imbued by love, is an act of creation. You can't make a table without chopping down a tree. You want to say thank you to the tree. You want to stand by that tree and visualize all the joy that will be experienced when people gather around that table. And you want the tree to say yes. Okay. That's the opportunity that's before us now. And the reason why they make those movies that you're talking about is because they're trapped in materialism. They can't see their way out of the box that they've built. They want to make a lot of money. They can't make them, you know, in Star Wars they did a little bit. Obi-Wan Kenobi telling Darth Vader, if you strike me down, I'll become far more powerful than you could ever imagine. That's what we're talking about. It does show up every now and then. Cloud Atlas, okay, gets in about this. So it does show up every now and then in limited degrees. Okay, but for the most part, they're interested in making money. And they use metaphors that are apprehensible to the people that are bound up in the system of making money. So it has to create a vision of something that's familiar to people. that currently gives them excitement, a logical extension. Okay. What we're talking about is something completely different. Okay. So have hope. It is scary. It is going to hurt. Don't suffer. No matter what happens, understand that a quick death, a painful death at an early age was the fate of almost all living creatures that have ever walked on this planet. Nature is brutal and very harsh. We are on this planet in this little teeny window of time, going back maybe 70,000 years, where we have the opportunity to practice to perfection our ability to give and receive love. And that opportunity only comes around in the universe once every 100 million years or so. So one of the things that I'm conscious of trying to engage in, this is part of the calculus of this whole process, is this: does humanity, does the earth complete this journey on its own? Or are there other dimensions of reality in a larger scope of influence? So look at the movie Contact, where Jodie Foster falls through. Okay? Yeah. It's whether we choose to reach out and participate. Okay? So this is a very, very beautiful, pregnant moment. And the thing that all that we need to do is to have faith and love that we are not forgotten. Does that work for you, Emily?
Yeah. It's beautiful.
Okay. Lauren, anything else that you're...
I really enjoyed that presentation. Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, and thank you both for participating. I will have this up tomorrow afternoon sometime probably. And as I said, this is the reason why I am here. I was brought into the world to bring this message to it. So anybody that you find in the same place, Emily, if you can't articulate yourself, given what I've said tonight, please let them know, okay? It breaks my heart to see young people without hope. Okay. All right. Have a good night.
Good night. Good night, Emily.